Hello, everyone. On this week's Energy Quick Chat, we speak to Benjamin Attia. Benjamin is a Principal Research Analyst in the Energy Transition Practice at Wood MacKenzie, a global consultancy. You're welcome to the show, Benjamin.
Thank you, Omono. Pleasure to be here.
So let's begin. Public electric utilities in sub-Saharan Africa are largely loss-making. What is the way out?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks so much for having me on the show. I would say there's no singular answer and there's no uniform answer, but I think that the simple way to think about this is that customers won't pay high prices for bad service, right? So high tariffs, low quality of power, low reliability. These are the sorts of things that lock utilities out of being able to become profitable, to have their customers be more satisfied, to consume more electricity. So I think there's a few ways we could approach this. One would be grid intensification. This is especially true for populations that are under the grid. So there's about 110 million people roughly across the region that live, basically within a few kilometers of grid infrastructure and yet don't have a grid connection. So those are some sort of low-hanging fruit customers, typically in urban or peri-urban areas, who will typically have higher demand with a very low cost to connect them. Relative to rural populations, Another way that we can do this is advanced metering. So making sure that customers are billed appropriately for the power that they consume rather than doing prepaid or assumed electricity charges, which is true in some markets. And obviously that makes customers relatively upset around paying for power that they may or may not have actually consumed. Beyond that, tariff reform is really important. As I said, paying a high tariff for low quality of power is simply, untenable, and rightly so. So as a result of that, thinking about how do we make tariffs cost reflective so that utilities can actually recover their costs and make sure that they're also affordable for customers. And one really great example is the service-based tariff in Nigeria, which allows customers to pay a higher tariff based on the better quality service they get and a lower tariff if the service quality is poor. And all of this would be achieved through regulatory action. Some technical assistance support might help here. But what really needs to happen is the utilities need to make sure that they're charging cost-reflective tariffs and offering high-quality service. That's kind of the key formula there.
Okay, thank you. So explain the idea of a bottom-up decentralized solar and storage grid that could transform Africa's energy future and for low-income earners in particular.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that we could think about this. I think maybe the best way to think about this is utilities using integrated energy planning or integrated electrification planning. And what that basically means is helping the utility understand where is the least cost solution most appropriate for each source of demand. So in some cases, that's a centralized grid that needs to be improved, like we were just speaking about. And in some parts of countries where it's not really financially tenable to extend the grid or to improve the quality of service of the grid in some areas, it may make more sense to build the grid from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And what we mean by that is that we would see solar often paired with battery storage and in some cases either hybridizing existing diesel to be able to achieve 24/7 power or something very close to that at a much lower cost with zero carbon, and then in a way that can be much more nimbly deployed too. So extending the grid means you need to start from where the grid ends, right? But if you are deploying an off-grid sort of captive self-generation system, it can be deployed anywhere, and it can, there's no fuel cost, there's no delivery cost, right? So it's simply, setting up a solar and storage system in a community once the demand has been assessed and it's clear that the customers will consume the electricity that the system produces. So what that means, especially for low-income consumers, is that while there was previously a very high cost hurdle to getting electricity from the grid to the last mile, you can sort of skip that where appropriate and where the economics make sense, and go directly to that source of demand and build a captive system on site. And that's a really revolutionary idea, particularly across the region where we're seeing this happening with sub-Saharan African markets at the forefront, deploying standalone solar systems and solar mini grids that can directly meet demand on site rather than waiting for the grid to arrive when it in fact never may arrive.
Okay, so here is a very important question. A lot of people have been looking out for this particular question. So let's get down to it. In your professional opinion, do you think sub-Saharan Africa can achieve industrialization using renewable-based decentralized grids?
Very good question, yes, and a very hotly contested question in many circles. I think the short answer is in some places yes, and in other places no. Some of these bottom-up grids are actually quite large, megawatt scale capacity. Some of the mini grid projects that are being rolled out in the DRC right now, for example, power hundreds of thousands of households, but also have capacity to power businesses. But on the whole, in general, most off-grid energy access solutions providing first-time electricity or hybridization of existing diesel gensets for SMEs are typically not large enough to achieve industrialization. So that's when I say appropriate energy solutions, it's really important to understand what that means. And that means that we're talking about the right type of solution to meet the right type of demand. So where we have large industrial users, some of them depend on diesel, some of them depend on the grid. Solar can play a role there. Decentralized solutions can play a role there. But ultimately, Africa's grid, the entire region writ large, speaking at a very high level, is going to need to do a lot of work to expand the generation, transmission, and distribution capacity of the centralized system to power larger loads that are economically productive, and particularly those that contribute to climate resilience. So it's really it's a contested issue. There's a lot of maybe overly gung-ho opinions about how this should go. And ultimately, I think on this topic and on many other topics, it's best to leave these decisions to the sovereignty of African governments, utilities, and regulators to make the decisions that are best for their own country and that align with the country's goals, objectives, and commitments. So I think there's a role for these solutions to play. On the whole, across the region, we estimate that roughly 20% of the investment opportunity between now and 2030 for the energy access and electricity sector is for decentralized off-grid solutions. And some of the larger systems can power industrial loads, but we're still talking about 80% of the investment opportunity being on the grid. So it's important to strike that balance.
Okay, so thank you for that. My next question is reliance only on renewables for electrification in sub-Saharan Africa without natural gas as a backup realistic?
Another good and hotly contested question. Again, I would say that, I think there's going to be individual countries with individual answers. So putting this, painting a broad brush across the region here is very dangerous. But I think in general, there is a role for gas to play in the markets that can cost effectively procure gas, whether domestically or imported, and whose grids are at a point where they need gas peakers. So in some cases, if you're looking purely at cost, in pretty much every market across the region, utility scale renewables, typically solar and wind, are going to provide a lower cost of electricity. But there are some grid challenges that get run into when you start adding large amounts of variable renewable energy onto the grid without battery storage. And battery storage is still relatively expensive. The costs are coming down. There may be a bit of a sort of slowdown in that cost decline this year and maybe into next year because of commodity markets and demand from electric vehicle sector. So the energy storage for front of the meter applications on the grid can be pretty difficult to finance because it's costly and because a lot of the regulations that are needed to fully compensate the value of that energy storage are not necessarily present in many of these markets. So the ability to compensate for demand response and frequency regulation, to basically provide peaking prices, some of these other sort of regulatory mechanisms that exist in more deregulated and wholesale electricity markets may not exist, or in fact do not exist in most regions, most parts of the region. So what that means is that having a certain amount of variable renewables on the grid without the storage, because it's expensive and because there's not the appropriate regulatory compensation, means you could start to run into some grid balancing issues. And that can happen relatively fast on many of the grids in the region because they're relatively small, right? They only have, in some cases, a few hundred megawatts or a few gigawatts of capacity. So before you start building 10, 15, 20 solar projects, you might start to run into some grid constraints around the fourth or fifth or sixth project, depending on how large they are. So in those cases where those needs are met, it may make sense for regulators to procure gas peakers. And if they can do that cost effectively and they need it to balance the grid, I think it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, and if it's just a cost question and those thresholds have not been reached yet, typically in almost every market, over the lifetime of the project, utility scale renewables will be cheaper. But there are some other constraints and considerations to be made there by those regulators.
Right. Now, a growing number of African energy ministers are advocating for an all-inclusive energy future comprising oil, gas, coal, and renewables for the continent. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I think there's again, individual sovereignty, individual decisions, and individual markets. But I would say from an equity perspective, I think they're certainly in the right to say that there should be a balance between historical climate change responsibility and responsibility for future mitigation. That's absolutely right from an equity perspective. I think when you take it down to cost, there are some other considerations there. And it goes back to what we were just talking about, right? In some cases, it does make sense. We do need gas. We do need, other sorts of conventional fuels, or it may make sense from a sovereignty perspective to decide to commercialize some of the existing resources that exist in the country. And from an equity and justice perspective, and with regard to a just transition, I think there's a very strong argument to be made there. When it comes to the domestic power sector, it first goes back to those cost questions. Just on a head-to-head basis, does it really make sense to build coal in pretty much anywhere in the continent? The answer is no. Even on just a pure levelized cost of electricity, let alone when you think about the sort of associated costs of building new coal generation. Renewables will win head and shoulders every time. When it comes to gas, that's true in most places, maybe not everywhere. And when it comes to upstream oil and gas, and when it comes to export markets, that's kind of a different question than what trickles down into the power sector. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, there has been a lot of rhetoric recently around the monetization of gas resources being connected to improvements in the power sector. And I just want to make the point that I think doesn't get said enough, which is that if you have domestic gas resources and a struggling power sector, there is a large value chain that needs to be built from gas to power. And there are many steps in that process that cost billions and billions of dollars. And there are many failed attempts along the way across the region to actually build that gas to power value chain. So what we've seen is that there's been some monetization of some of these gas resources that have been largely untapped, but the benefits are not trickling A, domestically into the economy, and then B, directly into the power sector. That's kind of said a lot, but it's not actually happening. And because there's a lot of steps in between those two things. And so I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
Okay. So how should climate change issues for sub-Saharan Africa be balanced with the necessities of energy access and security for the region?
Yeah, good question. I think that goes back to the last two things that we've been talking about, right? One, which is there is a difference between historical responsibility and future commitments for mitigation. I don't think that it is right for Western countries to tell sub-Saharan African countries that they cannot develop their own resources in the same way that the West has and has benefited from. However, it is also true that any additional new fossil fuel resources do contribute to climate change. So I think there needs to be a global conversation around, what does this look like in terms of the available carbon budget, balancing needs for climate change adaptation, mitigation, and economic development, because economic development also includes climate resilience, right? It's important to have higher incomes, more infrastructure to be able to withstand the impacts of climate change, because Africans are the least responsible and the most vulnerable to climate change. So there are absolutely equity considerations that need to be made there. But I think there's sort of, again, that second point is that there does need to be a stronger connection between the necessity for domestic resource development and how that actually trickles into the access to energy picture, right? Because right now, most of the progress that's being made in the access to energy picture is coming from off-grid solutions and from grid intensification in a few countries. And there's a bit of a disconnect in connecting those issues in the conversation sometimes, because there's a gap there in that value chain. And I think that's important to highlight, because it's not something you can really gloss over. Nigeria has been claiming this is the decade of gas, but the gas picture has not changed in almost 10 years, right? In terms of supply and demand. So, what does that look like in terms of improving the picture on the electricity sector, both on the grid and off the grid? And Nigeria, to its credit, has done an amazing job developing and fostering a really robust and bankable off-grid electricity sector through the National Electrification Program, through some of the reforms that some of the discos have been going through now, and then also through the fostering of this local industry for mini-grids and solar home systems through direct subsidy and indirect subsidy. So there's an excellent sort of track record in building and developing the bottom-up sector, but the penetration is still very, very small compared to the need. So I think, thinking about how do we accelerate that pace and how do we connect these issues between climate change, local resource development, and the power sector, because they're not all as next to each other as we might think sometimes. And there are actually some gaps between them and they cost billions of dollars to connect those dots. And it's not to say that it should or shouldn't be done, but we need to not gloss over those considerations.
We thank you so much for your time here on Energy Quick Chat, Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Omono. Appreciate the questions.
Benjamin Attia, Principal Research Analyst in the Energy Transition Practice at Wood MacKenzie. I am Omono Okonkwo. See you next time on Energy Quick Chat, where we speak to leaders from the energy sector.